So a very, very warm welcome to you all. Really nice to be here this evening. We've got people from lots of different places around the world, as well as people local in London. I'm based in London. Our school is based in London, but as you know nowadays, so much of the work we can also do through Zoom and through the technologies that we have. So it's really great just to be able to reach out to people in so many different places. I have absolutely no idea about what your backgrounds are. Some of you may be practitioners already. Some of you may be having had no experience, just curious about what craniosacral therapy is about. I'm not going to be making any assumptions of prior knowledge, and I'm just going to kind of go through some basic principles. My intention is that I'll talk a little bit, give you a little bit of an overview about the practice. There'll be probably a couple of times that I'll just open things up to question and answers during the evening. I've got a few questions that have already been sent in that I'll try to address as we go along, or take a little bit of time with a little later on. We'll also do a practical exercise at some point during the evening. And then at the end, just open it up for further questions. And if you've got any questions around training and what's next for those of you who may be interested in taking a next step, we can take a little bit of time to talk about all of that as well. So let's start a screen share, because I'm going to show you some images. So just to give me a moment with that. Yep, there we go. Let's do this. Get that. Bring that down and start to play. Okay, great. So this practice was developed by an osteopath whose name was William Sutherland. And Sutherland was a student in the first osteopathic school in the United States around the turn of the last century. And he was in his college laboratory one day examining a set of disarticulated cranial bones. And you can see in the model, in this painting of Sutherland, here is what disarticulated cranial bones look like. These are bones that can separate, the sutures can separate. And he was looking at some of the design and architecture of some of these sutures. And in particular, he was looking at this suture and one or two others that have this kind of overlapping beveling design. And he had an insight. It was a kind of a revelation. He described it later quite poetically. He said, "A thought struck me that these bones are beveled like the gills of a fish, designed for some kind of respiratory movement." This was what came into his mind. These bones are beveled like the gills of a fish, designed for some kind of respiratory movement. Anyway, he couldn't get this idea out of his head. And he was wondering, well, why was a human skull designed with over 100 different articulations, very specialized joints, each of them with a particular kind of architecture? Why would a skull be designed like this if there was not some kind of physiological purpose? So he really couldn't get this idea out of his head, and he decided to try to prove to himself, to show to himself that whether this phenomenon of cranial motion could actually exist. He took the idea back to his college professors. We've got a few people waiting to come in, Esther, just to say. Yeah. So he took this idea back to his college professors, and they kind of dismissed it and said, no, don't be ridiculous. The skull fuses in adulthood and no such movement could be possible. But anyway, he wasn't convinced by this. And he tried to prove to himself that his college teachers were correct. And he designed a very strange kind of contraption, a helmet that he could tighten up, made of leather straps, that he could tighten up in different directions. And his reasoning was that if there was such a thing as cranial motion, and if you could do something to prevent this motion from happening, it should be possible to experience the effects. So he put this helmet on and he tightened up the straps, and to his surprise, he started to develop symptoms that he didn't previously have, and symptoms that he just couldn't explain away in terms of what you would expect if the superficial blood vessels or the superficial nerves of the head were in some way restricted or compressed. He started to get not just local symptoms like headaches, but things like digestive disorders or sleeping difficulties. And then he would undo the straps and then tighten the straps up in a different direction. And then a whole new set of symptoms would develop. Maybe he would get loss of energy or depression or disorientation. So this was really not what he was expecting, but what it led him to is the understanding that there must be some kind of movement that happens through the head, through the cranium, and it must have some kind of physiological purpose. It must have some kind of physiological function. Now, in these early days, he was really concentrating and putting his attention on the movement that took place between the cranial bones. He was a great anatomist, and he studied the design and the architecture of these bones. And he could see that these bones would allow for certain types of motion. But within quite a short period of time, he realized that it is not only the bones that express subtle movement. He realized that the bones here on the outside are continuous with membranes that underlie the bones and that also partition the skull. And whatever it is the bones are doing, the membranes are doing as well. And furthermore, there is movement that takes place within the central nervous system, within the brain and the spinal cord, and also importantly, within the fluid that bathes the central nervous system. And also at an early stage, he realized that the sacrum is very closely connected. Whatever happens in the cranium is very closely related to what goes on in the sacrum. There are membranes that connect here at the base of the skull and then hang relatively freely down through the spinal canal until they reach the sacrum, where again they're fixed. And also that the fluids that bathe the central nervous system also go all the way down to the base of the spine. So he saw that there is also a movement, an involuntary movement, as he described it, that takes place at the sacrum that is in some way connected to the movements that he was discovering within the head. So he described this as a kind of integrated physiological system. He referred to it as the primary respiratory mechanism. And the primary respiratory mechanism is essentially a system of anatomical and physiological relationships that function closely together in expressing these subtle rhythmic motions. So this is where the term craniosacral comes from, because it describes this system of relationship. Dr. Sutherland referred to it as a craniosacral mechanism. So basically what's going on in the head, connecting to also what goes down in the sacrum as an integrated system that has very kind of key functions as far as our health is concerned. So this is where the term craniosacral came from. The term actually was first used by a student of Sutherland in the year 1950, when he first used the term craniosacral therapy. He added the name therapy onto it. It was an article in one of the osteopathic journals that started referring to this new branch of practice as craniosacral therapy. And from there, I'll talk a little bit more about the history and the development of the work. But from there, of course, things have developed a lot and spread quite considerably. So craniosacral refers to this anatomical and physiological system, and it's become known as, it's what this practice has become known as. But in many ways, it's a very inadequate and misleading term, because also one of the things that Sutherland realized from quite an early stage in his exploration was that these subtle movements that he first identified at the cranial bones and in the interrelationships of the membranes and the central nervous system and the fluids and the sacrum, that these subtle movements that he identified are not just restricted to this system, this integrated system at the core of the body. It is actually a whole body phenomena. And he realized that the whole body, not just these tissues and fluids at the core of the body, express subtle rhythms, and that these rhythms have significance for our health. So just in a nutshell, maybe just even as a brief summary now, right at the beginning of the talk, we can say that craniosacral practice works with these subtle rhythms, helping to create the conditions where places of stuckness or inertia or restriction can resolve in order to allow these natural movements to come back into play. And very simply, when things can move freely, when things can move well, they can function well. So the practice is really about helping to free up these subtle movements that take place in the body. And one of the other kind of interesting things is that when we address the subtle motions, the big movements also get addressed. So if we can address these very subtle rhythms, it makes a huge difference in the kind of the voluntary movements that we're able to do. So for example, we may well be able to start moving our shoulders or our necks or our backs or whatever it might be, whatever areas have been restricted. So first and foremost, it seems that our physiological function relates to how we move at these subtle levels. Now, I'm going to be talking a bit more, and we'll do a little bit of practice as well about what are these subtle movements, what might be their significance, and how might we sense them as well. Okay, so let me just see. Yeah, so basically Sutherland, as I mentioned earlier, identified that these subtle motions express as rhythmic movements. Now, what is a rhythm? A rhythm is where there is a movement in one direction followed by a movement back. So a rhythm has a kind of a regularity to it. It has a tempo, it has a rate, it has an amplitude, it has many, many different features. But Sutherland identified, very broadly speaking, very generally speaking, that the whole body expresses subtle rhythmic motion in two different phases. One phase he referred to as inhalation, and this is where, generally speaking, there is a movement, a rising up within the tissues and the fluids of the body, and a widening side to side. And that's then followed by the other phase of movement that he called exhalation, which is where there is a narrowing and a receding down towards the lower part of the body. Now, this is a generalization. Actually, within the body, each tissue, each organ, each part expresses rhythmic motion in a particular way. And one of the things that those of you who are going to go on and study this practice, or if you have already studied, you will know, is that you will get to learn what are the normal rhythmic movements for each of the body areas, for each of the body structures. And so that when you put your hands on and you start tuning into these movements, you can start to get a sense of what is normal and what might be in some way dysregulated or stuck or inertial, or be expressing some other kind of conditioned pattern of movement. When Sutherland started his investigation, he identified a rhythm that later became known as the cranial rhythmic impulse. It's a rhythm also, sometimes it's referred to as craniosacral motion. And on average, it has around 8 to 12 cycles a minute. That means that about 8 to 12 times a minute, there is one phase of motion followed by another phase of motion. And this is really where he started his practice. And he realized that when he started to put his hands on his patients, he could feel the presence of these subtle rhythms within each of the different tissues, within the fluids of the body. And he could identify where there may be some kind of restriction and inertia. And he started to develop a whole series, a whole range of skills and techniques to help to restore movement in places where things were getting stuck or inertial. And in the early days of his development of this practice, his skills and techniques were actually quite directive. They were quite mechanical. So he had an osteopathic background, and in his osteopathic education, he'd been taught how to work with the larger movements of the body, how to work with body manipulations, how to adjust different regions of the body in order to restore more normal function. And he took this principle into the practice that he was developing. But as he developed this practice, he realized more and more that actually this integrated system of rhythmic movement throughout the whole body responds better to less invasive forms of treatment. Now, again, I'm going to come back to that and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on this evening. But what I want to talk to you about now is that also, as Sutherland developed in the practice, he realized that there is not only one rhythm that is present. This is where he started. He started with the cranial rhythmic impulse, this 8 to 12 cycle a minute rhythm. And he started to work with this. He started to get some great results with his patients. In fact, he became known as the doctor to whom all the other doctors in the area would send their most difficult patients that they didn't know what to do with. But this guy Sutherland down the road, he was doing something strange and getting very good results with a whole range of different conditions and pathologies. So he did a lot of really great work working at this in this way. But he also realized from an early stage that there is not only one rhythm, there are actually a number of rhythms. There are rhythms within rhythms within rhythms. And this is something that has become known in biodynamic craniosacral practice as the primary respiratory system. So in the biodynamic approach to craniosacral work, we're working not only, and in fact much less, I would say, with the cranial rhythmic impulse, but more with these other rhythms that I'm going to describe to you, which are actually deeper rhythms, slower rhythms, that are also functions of our, let's say, deeper physiological function. So if we're able to work at these deeper levels, actually the work can be deeper acting and more long lasting. Clinically, it is just a more efficient way of working. So I want to take a little bit of time to describe this system that Sutherland started to explore, this system of rhythms within rhythms within rhythms. And I'm going to start this little description talking about what might be at the very core of these rhythms, what might be underneath these rhythms, as it were, from our kind of deepest places to our more superficial or peripheral places. Now, those of you who have experienced craniosacral practice will know that the work is done in such a way that the practitioner may place his or her hands on whatever it is that's being worked with and may leave the hands there for some time. It's not a form of massage. It's not a form of pushing or manipulation, but it's a way for the practitioner to be able to sense, to synchronize to the subtle motions that are taking place through using very light touch, and then working with creating conditions where places of restriction and inertia can begin to process and resolve. So in many ways, the work is very meditative. Sometimes the practitioner will place his or her hands on an area of the body, will start to sense into the function in that area, and may be there for 10, 15, even 20 minutes in the same place. And it happens, not that unusually in the practice, that when we do this, there is a settling that takes place. That when you first put your hands on, maybe you start to notice all kinds of different phenomena that are going on, and then things start to settle, and then maybe settle some more, and then settle some more. And it sometimes happens, not that unusually, that both the patient and the practitioner can start to access an experience of settling that is very profound, that is very deep. Now, this deep settling is something that one of Dr. Sutherland's students, his name was Dr. Becker, called dynamic stillness. And I want to talk a little bit about dynamic stillness because it also has, let's say, a lot of therapeutic applications, a lot of therapeutic consequences. Dynamic stillness actually doesn't just refer to a state of settling. It refers to a basic ground of stillness that is present, that is underneath all of our functions. Everything that we do, all of our physiological functions, all of our feelings, emotions, or whatever else, and expressions and personality traits, underneath all of that, there is a basic ground of stillness, which sometimes can be accessed within this practice. Now, this is really not perhaps so different from what has also been described in many traditional forms of medicine, as well as some meditation practices. In Buddhist practice, for example, there is a recognition, there is an acknowledgement that underneath all of our doing, there is a basic ground of just being or presence. In Buddhist practice, it's referred to as shunyata, which is often translated as emptiness or spaciousness. That this quality and this realm of spaciousness and emptiness is at the core of everything that we do and everything that we are. And in meditation practice, in some of these traditions, there are ways to be able to reconnect to this inherent spaciousness as a way of reconnecting to our source, to our essence. Now, it happens in biodynamic practice, in craniosacral practice, that sometimes this state, this experience gets accessed. And it gets accessed really if both the patient and the practitioner are able to enter a deep state of letting go. One of the features of this basic, can I say, inherent ground of stillness, dynamic stillness, is that it is always there. It's always underneath everything that we do, say, feel, and think, but that it is something that most of us, most of our lives, have become very disconnected from. We've just become so kind of, let's say, used to being, in our doing, in our activity, in our stress responses, that we lose any kind of connection to this basic ground of just being, where there is no doing. When we're able to access this, though, in a therapeutic session, it puts the patient, and I have to say the practitioner, back into this state of deep reconnection. And in this state of deep reconnection, when we deeply reconnect to what is at our essence, what is at our source, things can begin to reorganize. Things can begin to reconfigure. The analogy that I use around this these days is it's a little bit like if you've got a problem with your telephone or with your modem or with your Wi-Fi, and you call up the helpline and get through to somebody, and you say, look, I'm having a problem, my system is intermittent, it's cutting out, what is something is happening. What's the first thing that they always tell you to do? What's the first thing? Yeah, always they tell you, switch it off, leave it alone for a few minutes, switch it back on, and that'll sort out a lot of the problems. Well, we function in the same way. When we're able to access this state of just deep letting go, deep settling, deep resting, there is an opportunity for our body physiologies and our consciousness to start to reconfigure and to reorganize back into its kind of natural state. Now, this is very similar. This, what I'm describing here is also very similar to what is being described nowadays within the field of quantum physics. The quantum physicists are also describing this basic kind of ground underneath all manifestations of life, of stillness or spaciousness. They're referring to it as the 0-point field. In fact, one of the great physicists of our time was Professor Stephen Hawking. And this was one of the kind of key elements in his seminal work. And he said, the universe, in short, was spontaneously created out of nothing. Thus, if we want to trace our ancestry, thus all of us can trace our ancestry back to nothing. In other words, if we want to go back to the source, back to from where it is we came, then we come to a state of nothing. We come to a state of spaciousness. We come to a state of emptiness. Now, let me just try to get back to that earlier slide. For some reason, that's not working. There we are. As I say, this sometimes happens in practice, that both the patient and practitioner can begin to reconnect with this kind of essential stillness that's present within each of us. And the therapeutic consequences of this can be absolutely huge. Now, also, during the early stages of Sutherland's practice, he asked himself, well, what is it that is generating? What is it that is producing these different rhythms that he was starting to sense, that he was starting to palpate? And he played with many ideas, and there are still different ideas. This is still a topic of debate within our profession, and there are different theories around this. One of the early ideas that Sutherland had was that maybe these rhythmic movements are initially generated within the brain, within the spinal cord, and from there they start to move out and affect and spread to the bones and to the rest of the body. There are also theories that suggest maybe these rhythms are primarily generated within the movement of the fluid that bathes the central nervous system, the cerebrospinal fluid, and that from the cerebrospinal fluid, the motion then spreads out. There are also other theories that maybe it's a combination of different factors, a combination of rhythms within the veins and the muscles and the lung breathing that synchronize to create harmonic rhythms. Anyway, Sutherland considered some of this stuff and asked, himself, well, what is it that could be producing these rhythms? And he came to a conclusion that is very, I would say, very simple, but by no means simplistic. And his conclusion is that these rhythms are essentially produced, are essentially driven by nothing other than the impulse of life itself. It is the life force itself that is generating these rhythms as a movement that emerges from this basic ground of stillness. He described this as a groundswell of an emergence of life into form from this basic ground of stillness. Now, he experienced this, he perceived this. He perceived the breath of life as a kind of vivifying, animating force that we could say differentiates us from a corpse, that we have these vital forces that move through us, that as long as we're alive, when we're no longer alive, these vital forces no longer move through the body is no longer expressing these movements, there is no motion that's present. So here we come to one of the kind of key principles in the practice, and that is that life is expressed as motion. But it's not just a question of, well, are we alive or are we dead? Well, we're all alive, thank God. We're all here tuning in to each other this evening and exploring this work together. But maybe some of those life forces within us are not expressing and not able to express to their optimum ability. Maybe in some ways there may be fragmentations of function or inertia that affect this expression of the life principle within us. And in our understanding, this is one of the primary precursors to the development of disease and pathology. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But what Sutherland identified, and also had been described then by practitioners after Sutherland, is that there is, if you like, a first stirring of life as motion. It's a very subtle movement that a student of Sutherland, also one of the great pioneers in this practice, Dr. Becker, he called it the long tide. He referred to the long tide as this sort of subtle, most subtle rhythm that emerges from the stillness that Sutherland described, that emerges as a kind of groundswell from the stillness and expresses in slow rhythmic cycles. So you see here in this image that the long tide expresses in 100-second cycles. That means that it takes about 50 seconds, that's almost a full minute, for one phase of inhalation to complete and one phase of exhalation to complete. Okay? So the long tide expresses a very slow, subtle motion in 100-second cycles, 50 seconds one way and 50 seconds back. And Sutherland and Becker and others, and certainly people like me, see this as a kind of essential life breath. This is really the sort of the breath of life, the most essential expression of life, breathing into the body. And it has a profound influence upon our health and well-being. And again, through stress, through trauma, through a whole range of different factors, maybe toxicity, a whole range of different factors. The expression, the connection to this essential life breath can become fragmented, can become compromised. Now, also one of the experiential principles within the practice is that the long tide carries some kind of basic blueprint for health, some kind of organizing principle, so that when it is able to express through us, when we connect to this slow, subtle, rhythmic movement in an unimpeded way, there is a kind of essential ordering force that is able to help restore the body's function. At a deep level, this is essentially what organizes us, what vitalizes us, what restores us, what heals us. How do we know this? Well, let's say we don't know it. It's a kind of a, let's say it's a kind of, let's say a conclusion that we come to, because what we notice is that as the long tide becomes restored, if you're in a session and you start to reconnect to the long tide, to this deep, slow movement, the experience is that the areas of dysfunction or dysregulation start to come back into their original pattern of health. They start to heal, they start to become restored. So the conclusion is that the long tide must carry some kind of basic organizing principle that in some way acts as a blueprint for our health. Okay. Now, a few more things about the long tide, and then I'll talk a little bit about the other rhythms as well. The long tide has not just been felt and identified by craniosacral practitioners. It's also something that has been identified by biologists who do research with very primitive life forms called protoplasm. Now, basically, a protoplasm is a single cell organism. And biologists love to do experiments with protoplasm because, in a way, it's life in its simplest form. There was actually a time when we were all single cell organisms. At conception, we were a single cell, But from that single cell, we started to divide and then divide more and specialize into different cell types. But there was a time that we were a single cell. So we still have, let's say, some of the remnants or the features or the essence of single cellularity. Anyway, biologists have identified rhythmic movements that take place within these single cell organisms. It's called protoplasmic streaming. And when they measure the rate of this basic rhythm within protoplasm, it has a regular rate of 50 seconds one way and 50 seconds back. Now, according to biologists, we are protoplasm. We're just more complex forms of protoplasm. Now, interestingly, there's also been a lot of research that's done within the field of fascia over the last 10 or 15 years. And there are cells within fascia called myofibroblasts. And when these cells are put into a certain solution, also a basic rhythmic motion has been found expressing within these cells, 50 seconds one way, 50 seconds back. So this kind of subtle rhythmic motion is not, let's say, completely unknown, but it's not really been deeply investigated in human physiology. But one of the things that practitioners in this practice experience is that when we feel the long tide, when we sense the long tide, we sense it not just as a local rhythm, not just as a rhythm that expresses through the body, but as a much wider field phenomena, actually as a sense of the whole of the natural world around us, very subtly breathing in and breathing out. So the long tide is often sensed as a sort of basic rhythm of the natural world, a basic rhythm in nature. And when we experience it, and this is on one of the questions that was sent in advance, well, how do you sense primary respiration, first in yourself and then in the client? When we're tuning in at this level of function to the long tide, it's not so much that we're expressing a rhythmic movement, that we're breathing this rhythm. It's more that we are being breathed by it. It's essentially that we are being breathed by some kind of fundamental life breath that is actually much bigger than we are. It's actually a vast field of action. But when we reconnect to it, it helps to restore us, bring us back to normal. Okay, so in biodynamic practice, we learn how to synchronize to the long tide, how to create conditions that the long tide the expression of the long tide can be restored through our physiologies. We also learn how to, I would say, let go and be open to the presence of a deeper stillness, if it's ready to manifest, as a therapeutic principle, as a way of helping to work with our clients to bring them back to a state of integration. Now, I described the long tide as a kind of a transpersonal rhythm. It's a rhythm, it's not that I have my long tide and you have your long tide. I described it as a kind of basic rhythm of life that is in the natural world. And of course, we're part of that life. We're interchanging with that life all of the time. We're part of the environment. But we are also individuals. We are also discrete individual organisms, and we express discrete individual functions. And the understanding that we have is that as these vital forces of life, as the breath of life becomes manifest at an individual level, at an individual physiological level, it generates another rhythmic movement, which is a faster movement, an average of around 2.5 cycles a minute, which has become known as the mid-tide. So the mid-tide essentially is the expression of these forces of life as these forces of life manifest and become embodied in the fluids and tissues of the body. And the understanding that we have, and which is a very similar understanding to the understanding that's present in Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and other traditional forms of medicine, is that the fluids play a key role in this, that it's the fluid within the body, that it carries the essential life force. In Chinese medicine, it's referred to as qi. In Ayurvedic medicine as prana. It's the fluids that carry these essential life forces into our body physiology. Now, we may think of fluid only in terms of blood or cerebrospinal fluid or interstitial fluid, but we have to remember that everything in the body is fluidic. Bone is 60% fluid, muscles, organs, every living structure is primarily fluid. Water is the most common element within the body. So it's these life forces become expressed within the fluids of all the tissues within the body, generating this movement that we call the mid-tide. So the mid-tide is really an expression of the potencies or forces of the breath of life as they become embodied at an individual level. And this is also where a lot of biodynamic craniosacral practice can effectively take place, because the mid-tide can become restricted. It can lock up, it can hold stress, trauma, strain. And so this natural delivery of these organizing forces of life into the fluids of the body becomes in some way impeded, and disease or dysregulation is the result. Okay. So a little bit more. I'm going to maybe talk for maybe another 5 minutes, another few minutes, and then maybe I'll open up to questions, and then maybe we'll do a practical exercise and then start to look a little bit more at some of the principles of practice. Okay, so I've been talking for a little while, but just a little bit more theory, and then I'll open things up. So then we come to what has become known as the cranial rhythmic impulse or craniosacral motion. This is where Sutherland first started. It's where he first began his exploration of subtle rhythmic motion. But now we start to understand this really as the most kind of superficial expression of rhythmic movement. And an analogy that I'd like to give you to explain this is, if you imagine that you are looking at, let's say, sailing boats in a harbor, those sailing boats are going to be rocking on the surface of the ocean in quite a fast way, at a faster rate. And what is it that's determining the movement within those sailing boats? Well, it'll be a mixture of different things. It'll be the wave patterns that are there in the ocean. It'll be the deeper tidal movement that's present within the ocean. It'll be which way the wind is blowing. There'll be various conditions that can influence the motion of that boat. And this is a little bit like how I see the cranial rhythmic impulse. It's like each individual tissue, each individual bone, each individual structure or organ is kind of on the surface rocking in relationship to a variety of different factors that will be determining its movement. If we go a little deeper into the ocean, so not just onto the surface of the ocean, but let's say go under the ocean, we're then much more into the realm of slower movements. There may still be currents and movements that are going on, but much less waveforms, much less whatever way the wind is blowing will influence what's going on as we dive down into the ocean. You're much more into the realm of tidal movements. So remember the tides in the ocean. There is a rhythmic movement one way. The whole volume of ocean, of fluid, is moving in one direction and then moving back. And so it is. It's a very similar principle in the human body. You're much more in the realm of a tide, a tidal rhythm. And this is more the domain of the mid-tide. And then when you go down, particularly into the deep oceans, right down into the ocean floor, it gets pretty quiet down there. You're very much into the domain of very slow movements. Now, interestingly, also, just as an aside, oceanographers have measured in all of the deep oceans of the world, near to the ocean floor, a subtle, slow, rhythmic movement. And they call it, and you can Google this stuff and look it up, they call it the deep sea ocean wave. And it has a regular movement of 50 seconds one way and 50 seconds back. Now, in our analogy, as we go down deeper into ourselves, we start to enter that realm of the slower movements that are, let's say, closer to the ocean floor. And then perhaps in the analogy, we can just say, and it is only an analogy, that the ocean floor itself is that basic ground and stillness out of which and from which all expressions of life and motion arise. Now, essentially, if this system is integrated, if these different rhythms are in interchange with each other, if this system is able to express itself without any great impediment or conditioning, then essentially we are expressing states of health. These rhythms are essentially expressions of our essential health. And when we're able to restore their movement, people get better. So I'm going to come out of the screen share just for a few minutes. And take a little look around and see if we can just open this up to questions. We're going to do we'll do a little exercise after this, but do any of you have any questions, or do any of you, and you can ask questions in a few different ways. You can write them in the chat box. Maybe Esther, you can monitor that just to see if there's any questions that come up there. Or you can just come online and we can talk directly, whatever feels comfortable for you. So how are you doing? There was quite a lot of information, quite a bit of a download of information there in the first section. How are you doing? I get 1 or 2 thumbs up. Thank you. That's always a good sign. Any questions? Anything you'd like to ask?
Do I unmute to ask you a question?
Yeah, please do. Feel free. You can either, yeah, please feel free to do that.
I was the one that, I might have been the one that submitted a question about how do you perceive or palpate the primary respiration rhythm?
Yes.
And I heard you say that it's bigger than us.
Yes.
I've been practicing for quite a while, 10, 15 years. And
yes.
Sometimes I just trust that I'm in the territory. And sometimes I don't really have a direct sense of palpation of the impulse. But I know it's there. And I'm just wondering if you can give any guide or suggestion as to how I might track it. I don't mean to track it,
yes,
with a specific focus, but just be aware of it. That's all. Thank you.
Maybe I might come on to this actually, Jeffrey, shortly. I mean, I'll answer your question as best I can right now, but then I might just give a little bit more on it in the next section. But just to kind of broadly speaking, I'll show an image a little bit later. Each of these different rhythms we can understand as operating within fields of function. And there are relatively, let's say, smaller fields of function, fields that are under the skin within the body. There are also fields of function that extend beyond the body. And there is also a wider field of function, which is how I was describing the long tide, as a vast field of action. Yeah. Now, we can start to get skillful around synchronizing to those fields. Okay, it needs a little bit of practice. Now, I'm not trying to sell you anything at all, but in my book, Wisdom in the Body, which is unfortunately out of print, but there's a new edition that's coming out shortly, I do describe some perceptual exercises by how we can tune in to these different fields of function. But just as a general rule of thumb, the more settled we are, and the patient is, and the more spacious or wider is our field of listening, the greater there is the chance that we will start to tune into and synchronize to those deeper, wider fields of function. And the more narrow or the more active we are, the greater is the chance that we will start to tune in to those more, let's say, narrower or more superficial, faster fields of function. Okay, so that's just a kind of a general rule of thumb. Now, to learn that, maybe you've done some studies in this work before. I don't know anything about your background, but you can learn how to shift your perception. So it's a little bit like tuning in to a radio, at a certain frequency. You tune in at a certain frequency, you're going to get classical music. At another frequency, you're going to get heavy metal. Another, you're going to get a talk show, whatever. So we can learn how to synchronize, how to tune in to these different functions, to these different realms of function. But this takes practice. And as I say, I don't know what your background is, Jeffrey, but this also really requires time and mentorship and instruction and people, teachers, mentors who can work with you on this. If you want to kind of learn how to refine those skills, it's not something that will necessarily just come immediately, but it's a practice. It's certainly something that we cover extensively within our trainings, but you're based a little far away, so you may not be able to join us, but it doesn't matter. Maybe there are classes near to you where, you know, you have the opportunity to develop your skills, but it's basically a perceptual process.
I understand that, and I appreciate everything you just said, and frankly, I feel validated by the practice that I conduct.
Yeah.
And just to let you know, I have studied with Franklin, and this is very helpful to hear what you have to say right now. Thank you.
Beautiful. Well, you've had a wonderful teacher. Franklin is a beautiful teacher. Both he and I actually started our school together, back, I think, 38 years ago now, something like that. So we go back a long, long way. So I'm delighted that you've had good teachers and good instruction. But I think maybe, Jeffrey, that's as far as I can go with you now, as far as an introductory talk is concerned. You know, these things also, of course, they're sometimes very easy to say, but not always so easy to, you know, to practice. And you say, what can I say? You know, you say you've been in practice for 10 years. Yeah, well, you're still at the beginning. I've been in practice for nearly 40 years and I still feel at the beginning. So just keep digging, keep exploring, keep listening, study with different teachers, you know, see what you can learn, see what you can be guided. But the real learning, I always feel, happens when you've got your hands on and, you know, you can start to learn how to tune in and feel and identify and sense some of these different phenomena.
Thank you.
Yeah?
I've already experienced many times that the work teaches me what to do next.
Yes. Beautiful. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Jeffrey, for the question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Let's hear from maybe a couple more. There's a few questions that have come into the chat box as well. Let me have a look.
Do you want me to read them out?
Yeah, I'm looking at them now as well. Zanette, I hope you've rejoined us. I cannot hear for some reason. We'll leave and rejoin. I don't know if you're here, but
come back in now.
just come back in. That's great. Do you look to influence the cranial nerves such as the vagus nerve? And basically, yes. One of the beauties of this hands-on practice is that you can start to very skillfully relate to all of the cranial nerves. You know, if you can begin to work with any kind of dysregulation with any of the cranial nerves, if you with their pathways as well as with their function. And certainly we do a lot of work with the vagus nerve in a number of different ways, through our hands-on practice, through looking at the function of the vagus and such things as where it exits the skull, where it moves down through the neck, some of the vagal connections to both the lungs and the heart, the vagal connections to the digestive tract. And also on the training, we also bring in a lot of the new understanding around the vagus nerve that has been developed by people like Stephen Porges, the understanding that shows us that actually there is not only one vagus nerve on each side, there are anatomically and functionally, there are two vagus nerves on each side. They have different origins and different functions. It's not really the remit within an introductory talk to go into the details of that, but we go into a lot of details of that on the training, and we learn how to work with these different branches of the vagus. Ilona, you've got your hand up, so maybe you want to come in and say something, and then I'll see if I can address one or two other questions.
Yes, I would like to ask, everything is new to me, but because I have very sensitive hands and I'm looking to explain whatever I got in them, I'm working as massage, but I'm basically meditating with people now. And I went to Reiki, and now I'm doing some Reiki, but I got still some confusion when I'm listening to you, and you are saying about fields, and which is a little bit probably different tuning, which I would love to learn. But do you, when you say about sensations, do you, will there be some pulsating what we will hear, like, or needles, or like rain running? Is that all that something, is that sensations like coming out of this therapy? Because I feel all that, and I'm looking to land somewhere sort of officially something what I got here, and I that's why I'm asking what sort of sensations are there.
So basically the answer to all of that is yes, just a simple yes. We all will experience things in quite an individual way, just to say as well. So some people might get pulsations and sensations and warmth and heat and all kinds of things. So we learn what is the significance of those different sensations, but also we learn how to synchronize to the movements and to the forces that organize how we function. This is something very unique, I would say, within craniosacral practice. We're working with these expressions of subtle rhythmic motion. Within all of that, you may experience the things that you're saying, the pulsations and the different sensations in your hands. Essentially, though, we're looking at how these subtle forces are able to move. How are they able to express their function? And learning how to feel where there may be places of restriction or inertia or dysregulation that might require some treatment. Now, I'll also just add a little bit. The work is done, it's practiced through our hands. We put our hands on. One of the, we're going to go on to an exercise in a moment, and my God, I'm running out of time, so I better not talk too much, is one of the things we will learn is that the lighter you touch, the more you can feel. So you might want to play with that. Sometimes you kind of think, when you put your hands on someone, the deeper you go, the more you can feel and the more deeper acting you can be. Actually, the opposite is the truth in our practice. The lighter the touch, the more you can sense, the easier it is for this information to come to you. And just another thing to say, and then I'll kind of move on to someone else, is that the work has a foundation of being able to listen, of being able to receive these subtle rhythmic phenomena. This requires, because we're talking of things that are quite subtle, this requires the practitioner to be able to kind of orient herself or himself in such a way that it becomes easier to sense these things. And in many ways, it's a very kind of, I would say, a passive state. Learning how to feel, it's a sensory experience. It's not a motor experience. It's not something that you're doing. It's about how do you receive. Yes. And on our courses, we take a lot of time to support people to learn how to sense as a foundation of practice, because it's when you learn how to sense, then you can begin to know how to respond. Does it make sense?
Yes, thank you very much. A lot of sense. I know that I have to have to take the course. Thank you.
All right, beautiful. Maybe I'll take one more now. I hope maybe we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. I'm just going to take the next one. Heidi, welcome. I hope I've pronounced your name okay. Do some people have a greater capacity to sense these rhythms than others when learning? Yes, the answer. I think we all have natural propensities, but I think it's also true that some people have a greater capacity for sensing certain phenomena. So let's say some people might be really synchronized to the mid-tide, but it might take them ages to start to get a first experience of the long tide, or others will get a real good sense of dynamic stillness of a long tide, and then take them ages to get a sense of the mid-tide. So I think we all have different capacities, we all have different starting points, and that's what we work with. Great. Okay, so I think we should do a little exercise now. It's just a very basic exercise, and it's going to be an exercise in self-palpation. Okay, now we've done very little in a way theory. We've just, given an hour's introduction, something like that. But we're going to take a little bit of time just to, but follow me first, watch me first before you do it, to put our own hands onto our own heads. And we're going to just kind of listen for about 5 minutes. Now, before you do this, I'm seeing some of you getting your hands onto your heads already, but before you do this, just let me finish the explanation first of all. When you bring your hands onto your head, I want you just to bring them on to the kind of top and the sides, but like touching, but hardly touching. Yeah, it's like, if you're feeling any kind of pressure, you're much too hard. So like your hands should be really like floating. And you can go float through your hair. It's not like you have to kind of dig in. And so if you've got bushy hair or whatever, you can just let your hands kind of float on the surface. Yeah. And also, it's important that you get yourself as comfortable as possible. So if, for example, if you're going to be sitting there for, let's say, 5 or 10 minutes with your arms up like that, some of you might start to get painful shoulders, or you start to feel tense, then all you're going to be feeling is your own tension. You're not going to be feeling any of these sort of phenomena. So it's absolutely important that you get yourselves comfortable. You really got to look after yourself. So for some of you, I'm on a table here. I've got my computer on a table, so I can rest my elbows onto the table and just let my head kind of go into my hands like that. Maybe some of you can just rest your elbows onto your knees or something, just so that you don't have to hold your arms up for any kind of length of time. Okay. So in this exercise, we'll take it just maybe for about 5 minutes, and it's just going to be an open exploration, okay? We're not trying to do anything, we're not trying to fix anything. Doesn't matter what we feel or we don't feel, but we're going to take a little bit of time to tune into some of the different rhythms that might be present. The heartbeat, the lung breathing, and then just open up an inquiry to anything else. Okay, so that's the theory. Are you ready for some practice? Yeah, great. So if you can get yourselves comfortable, and when you're ready, I'm not going to do this for long myself because I want to kind of look at you, but when you're ready, just start to bring your hands in real slow. Don't just plonk your hands on, but bring them in real slow. And as soon as you start to feel the presence of your hands, whether it be on your hair or on your head, and use the flat of your hands, just kind of pause there. So the lightest of touch, as I said earlier, the paradox here is that very often the lighter the touch, the more you can sense, the more you can feel. Now, this is again, I want to emphasize a passive process. We're not trying to feel anything. We're just listening. And maybe there's a number of different things that we might feel. So for example, there's our heartbeat, there's our cardiovascular pulse. Now, we've got small arteries in our fingers as well as in the superficial blood vessels of our head. Maybe you sense some of the cardiovascular pulse. It's not always an easy thing to feel in this place, but maybe you feel some of the cardiovascular pulse, that faster rhythm with the heartbeat, maybe 60, 70, 75 beats a minute. And if you notice your heartbeat, and it's not always an easy thing to feel, just kind of identify, oh, right, yeah, that's my heartbeat. That's my cardiovascular pulse. That's there. That's a rhythm that's essential for life, of course. Just take a minute or two and just notice if you feel your cardiovascular pulse. Maybe it's there, maybe not. And then bring your attention to your lung breathing. Now that one's a little bit easier to follow because you can notice yourself breathing in. As you take an in-breath, you can notice that. As you take an out-breath, you can notice that. Now that's a slower rhythm. It's maybe around, 16, 18 cycles a minute on average. And also, as you take in that lung breath, you might notice that there's some of that gets translated through your hands or even into your head. I'm just looking around a little bit, and I'm going to just make one or two observations. I don't know your name, but the silent bond, maybe just lighten your hand contact a little bit. Yeah, not too much. Yes, yeah, just let it, exactly, that's it. Just felt a little bit too close, a little, so just kind of give a little bit of space between your hands. So let's take a minute or two and notice maybe the effects of lung breathing. Now, as we breathe in and out, we do actually have accessory muscles of lung breathing that come up into the base of the skull. And you might notice also some of the effects of that through your arms, through your shoulders. So as you breathe in and breathe out, just see if you can identify, yep, there's my lung breathing. You might feel the response to that through your head, in your hands. And then keeping your hands where they are, just for maybe a few more minutes, I'm just going to float the question to you, what else do you notice? Is there any other kind of phenomena that you might notice that you couldn't kind of, let's say, explain as heartbeat or lung breathing? Is there any other kind of movement or quality that you feel as you let your hands rest onto your head? Now, for example, maybe you feel a difference between your left and right sides. Maybe, let's say, the right side of your head feels a little more dense and the left side feels a little more soft. Or maybe you feel a pull or a twist, or maybe you feel a slower movement, a pulsation, a rhythm, or a force between your hands. And please remember, the more you try, very often, the more counterproductive it is. So just really take care to just let go, to rest, to get as comfortable as you can. To rest as much as you can and just to listen. As I say, it's a very passive thing that we're doing here. We're not doing anything. We're just being receptive, just listening to any qualities or impulses that come through our hands. What do we notice? It may not stay the same. It may change. So what you feel at the beginning may be different. It might shift. Maybe, as I say, you feel some difference between your left and your right hand. We'll take just another couple of minutes. Just coming back to a kind of open listening. If you find yourself straining, if you find yourself trying to feel something or to figure it out, see if you can just let go of the task and just come back to that open listening and see what comes to you. Sometime within the next minute or so, see if you can just start to slowly move your hands away. I don't want you to suddenly take your hands off, but just move your hands away real slow. Okay. So, how are you doing? Any of you like to share what you just experienced there? Maybe what you experienced there, you sat there for 10 minutes thinking, what the bloody hell am I doing? I didn't feel anything. That's also valid. But how was that for you? What did you notice when you just let your hands rest onto your head like that and take a little time just to listen? How was it for you? Any of you want to come on? Or you can also write within the chat. You're very welcome.
I felt that I could feel a difference. If I sort of moved my hands, it went lighter, and then I put slightly more pressure. That I could feel. It's quite hard doing it to yourself, because as you say, you can feel the pulse in your hand. You can feel, and it's quite hard to separate. But I felt that you could feel a difference when you were kind of pulsating slightly. You could feel that.
So you felt different things as you adjusted the kind of the pressure, as you gave a little more space or a little closer, you felt different things going on, yeah?
And also, I'd play around with my eyes. I did the action man thing where you'd move your eyes, and I could definitely feel that.
Yes, yes.
I felt that I could feel that.
Yes,
I could
great.
Feel movement, almost like a muscular thing.
Great. Your name is not John, is it?
No, it's not. That's what, my name is Georgina.
Hello, Georgina. Thank you. Thank you, Georgina. Yeah. Great. Anyone else?
Michael?
Yes,
Whoa.
Jeffrey. Yeah.
Jeffrey.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Jeffrey, do you want to go ahead?
Based on my daytime activity here, this was a wonderful exercise because it just slowed me down very nicely.
Yeah.
I'm aware of the cardiac rhythm and the respiratory lung rhythm. And then after that, it was very still. Very still. Thank you. Thank you for that guided work.
Yeah. Beautiful. One of the great challenges, I'm just going to say, and this is for all of us in this practice, because we're starting to synchronize to movements that are both subtle and also, in many instances, quite slow. One of the challenges is for us to slow down. It's very often only when we slow down that we can begin to feel some of these phenomena. You can imagine that if this is John, maybe a little bit coming back to you, slowing down also might be a key, in sensing some of the deeper tides within the primary respiratory system. If we want to sense something like the long tide, a very slow movement, of course, we can't do that if we're very kind of active and, busy in our attention. So, really slowing down and letting go is one of the fundamental prerequisites. So anyway, we're just starting to do that. So that's interesting. Okay, so Kasha has just sent me a message. I felt my right hand breath movements and my left hand didn't feel anything. And I almost slept. Okay, well, that's not unusual. Sometimes what happens, I have to say, sometimes when we start to slow down, we start to realize that we're tired as well. And we may well go to sleep. That's okay. But that's not unusual. You felt breath movements in your right hand, but not in your left. I wondered, I suspect that many of you others also felt that difference, that one side felt like it's moving and the other side not moving, or much less so. That's really interesting that you started to notice that. That's probably the case. Yeah, a few comments coming in. Anyone else?
I wanted to say how much warmth I felt.
You felt warmth, yeah, just in your hands, Rosie, or through your whole body?
Mostly through my right hand, a little through my left, and then pressure, sort of pins and needles in my thumbs.
Yes. Yeah. One of the principles, and Shantala, thank you, you felt warm in your body. Nice to see you, Shantala, welcome. And one of the principles of biodynamic practice, and somebody asked this question through email, is that we're working much more with the forces, the underlying forces that govern how we function, rather than just the effects of those forces. So rather than just, the manifestation, the symptoms, if you like, of those forces. And when we start to synchronize to those forces, we may well start to feel them a little bit like Ilona was saying, in many different ways through our hands. But one way that we can experience that is through heat. Heat is often experienced when we start to feel the potency, the forces that are present. It's not unusual. So thank you for that, Rosie. Oh gosh, we're running out of time.
Can I share something?
Yes, please do. I'm going to go on. Maybe we'll overrun a little bit tonight, but because there's a bit more that I want to do with you. But who is it who's speaking?
I was speaking.
Is it Annette? Is it right?
Yes.
Yes. Great.
Yes. So I actually have been experiencing extraordinary pain from the trigeminous nerve for a quite long time right now, due to a tooth. And when the tooth was taken care of, it actually not only woke me up in the night, but also I was experiencing this during the daytime. And what we did now, I couldn't lean my hands on the table because of the movement of the head. It became like intense in the jaw, actually the junction, where they are all connected, the three nerves.
Right.
And and I think the best way would have been having my hands as far away as possible, because it was very intense, even though I was touching, almost not touching, having them maybe a couple of centimeters outside. It was like, give me space, it's very intense sensation.
Yes. So just to say, I don't know where you are in the world, Annette, but if
in Sweden,
if you, maybe you're doing this already, but if you do find a good local craniosacral practitioner, I can recommend it. Maybe you know people there.
Yes, I am also working myself, and I know I have a wonderful colleague. Yes.
Beautiful.
She's doing wonderful work in biodynamic craniosacral therapy.
Fantastic. Yes. That's great. And, sometimes just to say, any kind of contact, if there's a lot of, let's say, a lot of pain, if there's a lot of trauma, any kind of contact can sometimes be experienced as difficult or activating. One of the things that we do in practice, and again, I just don't have time to go into this in, just in a short introduction, but there's always a negotiation of contact, moving in from afar, and just waiting. If things start to get too hot, let's say too difficult, too challenging, just waiting there, pausing there, not just diving in and putting your hands on and being there whether the person likes it or not. It's a negotiation. It's a negotiation with that particular person's physiology and where is their window of tolerance, what they can be with, what they can take at that time. But there are many skills that the practitioner can also develop that can assist that. So for example, and I don't know if you want to do this, but maybe your practitioner is doing this or you're doing this. But very often when you feel, if your hands are coming in and you're feeling that your hands are getting pushed away or it's too much, if you can really get a sense of the transparency in your hands. So rather than your hands, as it were, being solid and holding something, but really starting more to relate to the transparency in your hands, you may find that whatever it is that's present can just go through your hands without, or with a lot less resistance. Now, these are refinements of palpation, again, that we'll go into a lot more detail if you're going to come on and do whatever next steps you might want to do with us. But there are ways that the practitioner can negotiate the contact. Now, we were just doing this with ourselves right then, but to negotiate the contact so that it feels both safe and appropriate to that person's physiological needs at that time. And that's also an important principle. So thank you for raising the issue.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Well, goodness me, look at the time. I'm going to come back, I think, to just show you a couple more images. And then, I think we'll just wrap up. I might go on a little bit. I mean, if you need to go, of course, go. But I might go a little bit over the 2-hour mark. Let's see what's needed. But I'm going to come back and I'm going to just flick through a few more images with you. Let me just get that spotlight again and then to play. All right. So this image relates to something I was talking about earlier, that essentially these rhythms, these 3 primary rhythms, and I don't think there are only 3 rhythms, there are a lot more, but these 3 primary rhythms that we commonly work with in craniosacral practice, these all are, as it were, fields of function. So there's the physical body, which is very much the domain under the skin of the cranial rhythmic impulse. So if our attention is relatively narrow and just focusing on the tissues and fluids under the skin, there's more chance we'll start to feel the cranial rhythmic impulse, and we can work with that. The mid-tide is a wider field of function, sometimes called the fluid body. It includes the physical body. It includes, as I say, all the fluids, the tissues, and the organs within the body. But it also includes the field immediately around the body, the potency field around the body. And as a whole field, we call it this field of tissues, fluid, and potency, is breathing in and breathing out at that slower rate of an average of 2.5 cycles a minute. And then there's the wider field of function, sometimes called the tidal body or the body of the long tide. And as I described, that's a much wider field. I'm going to just flick through a few slides and then we'll maybe open up for question. So we become patterned by experiences that we're not able to resolve. We become conditioned. We hold places of inertia within our bodies. Okay? This may happen through physical factors, blows or traumas or falls or road traffic accidents or difficult birth. It may happen through emotional factors, neglect, abuse, may create areas within our physiologies where there is contraction, where there is restriction, where there is holding. Maybe there are biochemical factors, hereditary factors. There can be a whole range of different things. So we become, as it were, shaped. We become patterned by, the experiences in life that we and not able to resolve. I don't know. I don't know this photo, this woman, but you can kind of imagine that she has been, working in the fields for the last 50 years, and her body has become shaped and patterned by the burden of the work. I mean, this is my fantasy, this is my imagination. I actually have no idea what her story is, but it's just to illustrate a point. So we all have this, and this process begins right at the start of life. Actually, even a single cell at conception is responsive to its environment and will contract even before there's a central nervous system. There's no brain, there's no central nervous system or muscular system at that stage. But just at a primal level, if we're faced with threat or danger or some stressful or traumatic experience, the natural response is to contract. Now, if we're able to resolve that contraction, we can come back to normal, natural motion. But sometimes the experiences that we have overwhelm our capacity or overwhelm our ability to be able to resolve them. And so we retain this kind of patterning. We become shaped by life's experiences. We often will take on the shapes of our primary caregivers, not only the accidents and the traumas and the things that happen, but we become shaped in a certain way. And maybe sometimes those shapes, let's put it this way, don't always serve us in the best possible way in terms of our sense of health and motion and freedom to be ourselves and to express our natural movement patterns and our natural forces. This next one is a little bit of a joke. I just like this card. It was sent to me. So we become shaped by our patterns and our experiences, and we hold places within our bodies. We can call them fulcrums. It's a place that organizes motion. So instead of motion being organized in its natural, unrestricted way, we hold these focal points of inertia within the body. And these are essentially the places that we need to treat. These are places that are not fully breathing with the forces of life, and not fully getting vitalized and nourished, and not fully connecting to their essential blueprint of health. And the experience we have is that if we're able to help these trapped forces in the body to resolve, and this area starts to again open up and breathe, then people get better. This is the key. If we can restore the expression of primary respiratory motion in places where there is inertia, health follows. These rhythms are essentially expressions of health. And we do this through our hands. Actually, I'm not going to try and explain this picture, it's too far, but it's a representation of the proportion of the nervous system that is dedicated to receiving sensory information from our hands. Our hands are incredibly sensitive and can pick up on a tremendous amount of information. Even there are experiments, I have to tell you. Oh, somebody's got their sound on. If you don't mind turning it off, that would be great. It's been discovered through experiments at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology that the hands are even light sensitive. People have been able to put their hands into a chamber and blindfolded, and without the presence of any heat or other impulses, a light has been switched on and off, and way beyond the realms of probability, subjects can identify when a light is on and when a light is off. just through sensing through the hands. So the hands are incredibly sensitive. For those of you who are going to come and join us on our training, we're going to take a lot of time learning how to connect to that natural sensitivity that is present and how to use these instruments to create conditions for health. So, a few basic principles. And as I mentioned earlier, the biodynamic approach is very non-invasive. We tend to work with the innate forces, the natural forces of primary respiration to make the corrections. We as practitioners don't manipulate and move and direct. We can sometimes support and augment and offer invitations or suggestions, but it's not a directive practice. We're using the natural forces of primary respiration to make the correction. Actually, within each of us, there is an indestructible tendency to find health. Dr. Becker, who I mentioned earlier, he described this as the bioenergy of wellness, and he called it the most powerful force in the world. So each of us, no matter what we're suffering with, how much, how tired we are, how much pain we're in, how depressed we are, whatever chronic health conditions maybe we have or we don't have, whatever conditions, we are still within all of that seeking the best possible health, the optimal health that is possible given those conditions, given those circumstances. And as craniosacral practitioners, we're simply trying to support that natural capacity, that natural propensity of health to reorganize and come back to normal. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is that if we're going to create change in ourselves, we need to address what organizes the disturbance. We need to organize the source, the fulcrums, the places of stasis, of dysregulation, maybe in your chest, in your head, in your central nervous system, in your jaw, in your cranial bones, in your liver, in your fascia, wherever it is. We work with the whole body, helping to resolve whatever it is that's being held at the fulcrum. And for the fulcrum to resolve, we need to resolve the forces that organize the fulcrum. It's not just enough, to, for example, if I have tight shoulders, and I love massage, but maybe you can massage my shoulders and I'll start to relax them and start to feel a lot better. But maybe 2 or 3 days later, my trapezius muscles might just start to tighten up again. What it means is, at a symptomatic level, we've been managing to, help to soften the tissues, but whatever forces are drawing my shoulders into contraction, that's not yet been addressed. So within biodynamics, there's much more of a kind of an orientation, I mentioned, to address the forces that organize the pattern. And another principle, which I'm not going to unfold tonight, but I'm going to leave for those of you who want to come on and do more, we'll be exploring this a lot more, is that for the forces to organize, perhaps the most favorable circumstances are states of settling and stilling. And if we can facilitate or support states of letting go, settling and stilling through skillful touch, then there can be an opportunity for those deeper forces to resolve and we can come back to normal. Okay, so that's the end of, oh no, it's not the end. Sorry, I've got another couple of slides. Sorry, I'm just gonna take 2 or 3 more minutes and then maybe I'll open up to more questions. So that's the end of the kind of the main presentation. But Oops, let's come on to. I wanted to talk a little bit about the training. So I know some of you are interested in going further. I want to just give a brief overview and then open up to some questions. We started training in October in the UK. It's a very comprehensive training, over 11 seminars. Each seminar is 4 to 5 days in length. The seminars are approximately 2 months apart, so it gives a lot of opportunity for people who are living long distance to attend, and also for integration of the work. There's a broad range of skills. I've touched on a few skills tonight, hopefully giving you a flavor or a sense. The training is very much based on practical work. We do a lot of hands-on work in the classroom, usually at least 2 exchange sessions each day. Because we cover the theory, you've got to learn the theory, you've got to know some anatomy, but essentially the skills are learned when you've got your hands on someone. And we keep a tutor to student ratio of 1 tutor for 4 students at all times, in order to give a lot of supervision and feedback during class time. I'm going to run through some of this quickly. I don't want to go into too much detail because we're overrunning a little bit. There is home study and practice to do between the seminars. We also have a unique teaching clinic that our students can gain clinical experience during the 2nd year of their training. We have highly experienced teachers, including some, pioneering teachers and great team of assistants at the Trust. We've developed a lot of creative teaching and cutting edge teaching. The curriculum has been, well, as I mentioned earlier, we started the school, I think it was 38 years ago. So let's put it this way, we've had lots and lots of opportunities for making mistakes and for refining things and for developing the curriculum and developing our way of teaching. I'm really, really happy with the shape of the curriculum as it is these days and the way in which we unfold the work. There's a lot of tutor support that's given between the seminars, and also something which may be of interest for long distance people. We've adapted, during these times of COVID, we had to last year do a number of our seminars online. And what this has meant is that, and we started a new training in October as well, which is, I think we're just about to go into the 4th seminar, but we brought in this new thing that students who are traveling long distance, who for whatever travel restrictions or quarantine would be unable to get to London, you could attend up to the first 4 seminars online if you can't get to London. And the online participants are sent a schedule in advance, and they are asked to find practice clients to work with at home. So you participate in the practice sessions along with the classroom, and we observe you and work with you via Zoom. And it's actually working really well. Now, if you can get to London and you can attend in person, I have to say there's no substitute for being there in person, but it really works okay, and it's been working well. The people who have attended online are actually doing really well. So it provides a great foundation for professional practice. So whether or not you are already a therapist, or whether you are wanting to come in as a change of career, it provides a great foundation. Just one more slide. For those of you who want to take a next step, I want to just draw your attention that I'll be teaching an introductory weekend in London on May 28th and 29th. So what is that, a couple of months away. We're not going to be doing this online. Unfortunately, we don't have the facilities for doing a Zoom option on that intro weekend. But if any of you can get to London at that time, and would like to join us, we'll be unfolding a lot more of the principles that I started to look at tonight with you, and we'll be doing some table work. We'll be doing palpation sessions with each other. We'll be learning how to sense conditioning within the body, patterning within the body, and we'll also learn a treatment skill. So that introductory weekend will give you an opportunity to visit the school, to experience our teaching before deciding whether or not you want to take any next step. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm really happy to take a little time for those of you who it's not too late at night. If you've got any questions, please do feel free to ask. Heidi, when do you expect your new book? Heidi, I've just finished it. I've finished the 3rd edition. I've updated it. It may take a couple of months now. Interestingly, just yesterday, I finished the last edit on it. It is out of print at the moment, but you may be able to get this is the 3rd edition. You may be able to get copies of the 2nd edition somewhere, but it'll hopefully be within the next few months that it'll be on the shelves. Geneviève, the nature and approximate time commitment of self-study between the seminars. So basically, we ask you to practice an average of 2 sessions a week between the seminars. We ask you to do feedbacks, to give written feedbacks. There's some reading to do. There's no big kind of essay questions. There's a few short reflective questions. There's a few anatomy explorations to do. The feedback that we get is that on average, students take about 4 hours a week for their home study and practice. So if you're coming on the course, some people do more, some people do less, but I would want you to feel that you've got a half a day a week or a couple of evenings a week that you could dedicate to your home study and practice. Do we have advanced courses? Yes, we do. You can look on our website. And anything else? Anything you'd like to know? I don't know if I've caught all of the questions.
I have a question. Are you hearing me?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeffrey. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is a little bit aside from what you've been presenting, but I'm wondering, do you have any contacts in Eastern Europe where practitioners might be involved in helping refugees with traumatic experience?
The short and the long answer is a very big yes. Just to say, I've been teaching in Russia for the last 18 years, and I have many, many colleagues and students in Russia. And I've also been teaching in Ukraine, and I was actually due to be in Kiev 2 weeks ago. Well, as you can imagine, I didn't go. But I have many dear friends and colleagues. Just to say, we're actually very active. We're doing a lot. We're actually meeting once a week with our Russian and Ukrainian colleagues online to do work together. And if you are a craniosacral practitioner, you're welcome to join us. We had a meeting yesterday where we had a gathering, a support gathering of 130 practitioners from around the world, including about 15 who were tuning in from Ukraine, in some occupied areas, just doing a kind of a healing meditation practice together as a form of support. That is open to all craniosacral practitioners. Just contact Esther if you want any more details, or look on our Facebook page. Okay. Now, also, we are putting in place other things, but you know, I'm not going to go into details of that right now.
No, I didn't. I appreciate, no details.
Also, we run courses in Poland. We have a lot of graduates and students in Poland. I also have been teaching in Czech Republic for a number of years. So in Eastern Europe, yes, we have a lot of people, and a lot of them are doing what they can.
And one last question, what's my best contact for that connection?
Contact the administrator, contact Esther.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
All right. Any other questions? How are you doing? Should we leave it there? We've overrun 10 minutes. Is it enough? Yes. Well, big thank you. I mean, look, if you've got more questions, just send them in. If any of you have any, you want to talk a little bit more about what's involved, you're very welcome to be in touch. You can have either through email, you can have a chat with Esther or with me or with one of the other senior tutors if you've got questions around what's involved with the training. So if you do have any other questions, just be in touch. But thank you for joining. Thank you for your comments as well. I really appreciate it. I think it's lovely to be able to do these things, whilst there's so much madness going on, just to be able to kind of meet together to do these things. So I really appreciate you joining us this evening. Big thanks to Esther for your wonderful admin and support and for being our Zoom technician as well. So much appreciation. And I hope to see some of you. Some of you I know will be seeing, but hope to see some of you. Just be well and be healthy and stay safe wherever you are. Sending you warmest wishes and thank you for joining.